Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jim Saunders, Jr., Associate Professor of Art, Chair of the Department of Art and Art History, Director of Hunt Gallery, and co-director of the Susan Paul Firestone Lecture Series in Contemporary Art. Now, you've already checked your phones. Those of you that arrived later, I missed some of you. If you don't mind, just check the phones real quickly, put them on manner mode, and while you're doing that, I have a question for you and a short story. The question is, how does a series like this begin? Okay, short story. It was the evening of Monday, February the 13th, 2006. Friends and acquaintances were gathered for dinner at the home of Professor Emerita of Art History, Dr. James, to celebrate the opening reception of the show Psychic Stages, work by Susan Paul Firestone. I was seated, I can see it just like it was yesterday, next to Mr. Graham and Professor Emeritus Paul Ryan. And the two got into this conversation, no doubt inspired by the exhibition they had just seen. And they were talking in art dialogue talk, right? And if I could describe it visually, I thought, how can I describe it visually? I would describe it as it's like the air was just filled around them with a migration of monarch butterflies. It was crazy. And, why should that end? Those moments that happen like that, why let it end? That was the moment it was born, the series. The idea to share this exciting exchange of ideas with the community at large, at least once a year. And Mr. Graham generously funded the first event. The series, launched that Monday evening back in 2006, in honor of Susan, has attracted top artists from around the world to work with our students and provide this annual public lecture. It's a hallmark of the cultural calendar here at Mary Baldwin, and indeed the region. Professor Emeritus Paul Ryan, art critic and painter, and the catalog that accompanied the exhibition, Psychic Stages, wrote the following. Susan's interest in both art and psychology developed at Mary Baldwin College, where she graduated in 1968 as a psychology major. Immediately after graduation from Mary Baldwin, she began a serious study of studio art. She studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, that's in Philadelphia, Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine, the Corcoran School of Art, which was in Washington, D.C., and at the American University, where she earned an MFA in painting in 1973. In that same catalog, the fiction writer, critic of contemporary art and visual culture, independent curator, and professor of English at Principia College, Diamond M. Ryan, wrote the following. In considering the work and life experience of Susan Firestone, one almost has the sense of someone like a mythic heroine in an old tale, moving through the dark woods by traversing intertwining paths, now traveling the path by the rocky stream, now the one under the tall pines, but obliquely yet inevitably moving towards a single destination that, again, like that object of an old tale, has a fine clarity, a golden meaning. Professor Ryan continues. Her passage as an artist has been inextricably tied to her passage as a professional in art therapy and psychoanalysis. And these interweaving journeys touch at those points where a compassionate comprehension of the human psyche through its iconography leads to transformation. So, tonight, we have this unique opportunity to welcome Susan and her family, who are joining us, we hope via live stream, but they're joining us by watching this. And we welcome Susan, Mary, Lucy, John, and George this evening. We are so grateful to each of you for joining us in this video. And those of you viewing this at a later time, we have some audiences who will view this at a later time, and to each of you here, again, we are so appreciative of your attendance. So it is really a privilege to be associated with this wonderful series, serving as co-director alongside my colleague, Assistant Professor Martha Saunders. We'd like to thank the following individuals for their contributions and support of this project. Dr. Ernest Jeffers, Vice President of Student Engagement, for his efforts to support us this evening. Mr. Charles Davis III, our Vice President of University Advancement, for his time, energy, and expertise in facilitating this evening. Our videographer, Richard Adams, and our band musician, Mike Dunaway, Information Manager of Operations, and Studio Art Major, Marcus Brunson. These are tech support this evening. Thanks, Marcus. You give us comfort knowing you're here. And we are particularly grateful in conclusion, but most really importantly, to the Firestone family who have worked with us to provide funding through the Roger S. Firestone Foundation to ensure that the Firestone Lecture would happen again this year. And now, I'd like to invite my colleague, Assistant Professor Martha Saunders, to the podium.
It's so good to see all of you, and I, of course, have been really excited about this. For a long time, I've wanted Lesley Dill to be on our campus, and she spent a lot of time with her students today and had some really deep conversations. But I get to introduce one of my students, one of our students, and her name is Georgia Foster. She is a rising senior, and she is a double major, both in arts management, but in studio art, and also minor in art history. Georgia is also involved in our gallery and helps as an intern there. So she is really, like many of our students, helps a lot in our department. She is embarking on a senior project that will be next year. She started work already where she's going to be investigating or reinvestigating goddess imagery in painting. So, Georgia?
Oh, I'm so short. Thank you. Lesley Dill is an artist whose work should be familiar to any art student at Mary Baldwin. For so often, it is her work which is presented to us as example and inspiration. Our artists working in drawing, painting, and printmaking can each find connection to Lesley Dill's work because she masterfully combines each of these mediums. She is a thinker and a creator. 2 years ago, Martha introduced me to Dill's work when I was struggling to incorporate language into a piece. And that introduction taught me that literature and writing can be a vessel for, expression just the same as paint and charcoal. I've been an admirer of Dill ever since. It would take me an hour at least to list all of Dill's achievements, but I will give you a few. Her exhibition, A Singular Vision, was at the MoMA for 3 months in '97. In 2008, she wrote and composed an opera, Divide Light, which used the language of Emily Dickinson as its tools. Recently, a still from the opera was used for the cover of the 2022 Oxford Handbook of Emily Dickinson. And finally, which I think is the greatest achievement for any artist, Lesley Dill is still thinking and still creating, and she's here today. Mary Baldwin, believe me when I say it is my honor to introduce to you Lesley Dill.
I'm Lesley Dill, and thank you for all the listening, to all the generosities that I've just been listening to. And I'm just going to jump in. So, next. It is such a pleasure to be here tonight. And tonight I will be talking to you about my exhibition, Wilderness, Light Sizzles Around Me, which is currently traveling to 7 museums across the country. And it began at this museum, the Figge Museum in Davenport, Iowa. So I always like to thank that curator for traveling this exhibit to 6 more places. Next. I want to give gratitude to the Native American peoples who have come before on this land that Mary Baldwin University is upon. The Menahok, the Shawandasi, Tula, and the Monacan. Next, thank you. And I especially want to thank my friend and fantastic artist, Jean Quick-to-See Smith, for opening the door to my heart to investigating our Native American people. Thank you, Jean, for encouraging me with your words and encouraging me to, she told me that if I walked in the shoes of others, I would be walking into the light. Thank you. Next. So, I am fervent tonight. I stand here fervent before you to give you this talk. And how did I come to feel so intensely about this exhibition, this journey that actually took me 7 years to make? Wilderness, Light Sizzles Around Me. It first happened through an unnoticed corner of my mind. This unnoticed corner of my mind opened up to an awareness. It opened up to an awareness of ignorance. Next. So here's the background to how the conviction to make this exhibition happened. I've been working in my art and also in my opera with words of Emily Dickinson for many, many years. From her quiet inward life up in Amherst, Massachusetts, she hid away passages. Next. Filled with wonder and visionary strangeness. Next. Her poignant and haunting words landed deep in my psyche. Here is the actually finale dress for the opera, and this is, I still hope, is going to go on the cover of the Oxford Handbook. It hasn't been published yet, so I'm still hoping. But these words are, take all away from me, but leave me ecstasy. Take it all away, but leave me ecstasy. Next. And acted as a reminder of the deep, dark woods of Maine and the Adirondacks where I grew up. Next. Then one day, being immersed in Dickinson, a random thought came, like a new bird landing on a branch of my mind. So this was the thought, or rather question. So this is one of those dumb questions that you don't want to even acknowledge that you're thinking, because it reveals how ignorant you are. So here's my dumb thought. It was, when did Emily Dickinson actually write? I've been working with her words for many, many years, and I never thought about context. So I think I had never asked myself this because of my belief that poetic words just exist in a country of their own, floating in the air, like a suspended poetic geography without time. Next. I'm so happy to be here, but I will tell you that I am actually allergic to flowering trees. So I have a little craggy voice, but this here I am, as you can tell. This blank place in my mind became filled with a huge hunger to know more about the history of my country, I just was so shocked at my own ignorance. So what did I do? I read and read and read. Next, let's start with the theme of wilderness. I think the very sound of the word wilderness has a ringing potency. And hearing it, wilderness, I feel a mix of invitation and also foreboding. An invitation into something unknown, unpredictable, yet nourishing. Next. For the entry banner, I wanted a more primal sense of this word, wilderness. So in looking it up and reading about it in a book, I went for its ancient source, which is wildiorness, a very, very old Norwegian word that combines deer, next, with wild, which meant simply uncontrolled, like boiling water, or one could say sizzling water. Next. This image of the deer leaping with the ancient root word for wilderness is for me the anchor point of the exhibition of early visionary Americans. Next. My deep New England roots link me by family to become fascinated with the early white settlers facing this wilderness. So as I researched, I found that these religious New England people coming from Europe became obsessed with, next, salvation and grace, as well as with the fearful wilderness, next, out there, surrounding them, and the wilderness inside us. They were escaping religions that persecuted them, and they were coming here fervent to found their own. Shadowy places of both deviltry but also divinity. To me these days, in 2022, I think more of the deviltry within these settlers' minds who took as though entitled these forest lands from Native Americans, for whom the forests were not places of shadows and devils, next, but a home, a refuge, and a sacred place, next. I hope as you watch this talk that you will think of it as a walk through the woods. You can wander through it also virtually on the Bates College Museum of Art website, as well as mine. It's a really cool virtual thing. Next. You search and you find phrases and images interwoven into the banners and cloth sculptures. Next. And I hope tonight, as you encounter my themes of wilderness in the American past, that you recognize why it is such a powerful touchstone of inspiration for me, and how it still resonates today in this ever-changing present that we have. Next. So when did my own family, I didn't even register this, when did my own family arrive here in this wilderness from England? My cousin Annie sent me a genealogy of our family, and it turned out that we arrived in Massachusetts in 1636. So I looked at that time period, and who was alive for me to look at and to be interested in, as myself a woman, now interested in history, interested in poetry, in reading, and of course, interested in theology. Next. So in 1637, Anne Hutchinson, wife, mother of, 15 children, was put on trial for religious heresy. So why was this? Why was she put on trial? It was because the Boston Calvinist male ministers excommunicated her for teaching from her vision of true grace. Next. On the boat coming over, she had seen a bird, a dove, although personally I think it was probably more likely a seagull, but a dove is what I read. And the vision, the glimpse of this bird at that moment somehow opened up the entire world for her to see the kingdom of God laid out before her. So she began to teach from this experience, that anyone could have this experience of grace, in her home. Next. So She said in her defense at her trial, "If any come to my house to be instructed in the ways of God, what rule have I to put them away? Do you think," and this was to a court of all men, "do you think," poor little woman, she was actually pregnant at the time, "do you think it not lawful for me to teach women? And why do you call me to court?" These ministers scorned her for her personal and ecstatic relationship to God, because as ministers, they believed otherwise, and they wanted to control who and how the people in their congregation worshipped. So they scorned her. They scorned this outlier with very intense language. Be prepared, it's a little sexual. Next, this language which I'm going to read to you. This is what Jonathan Winthrop said to her. He called her this American Jezebel, seeing the fluentness of her tongue and her willingness to open herself and to divulge opinions and to sow her seed in us, which I think is something of a biological puzzle for her to have sown her seed in all these men that were scornful of her and judging. So there she was, sowing her seed in them. And they also said she had rather been a husband than a wife, and a preacher than a hearer. So I always like to say how grateful I am to live these days when we don't have any issues like that. Next. But so yay, Mary Baldwin, right? We really appreciate women that step forward. Here we are. About 100 years later, in the 1700s, the magnetic Jonathan Edwards, preaching to Northampton, Massachusetts, would vehemently dedicate himself to exactly what Anne Hutchinson was excommunicated for, a personal experience of God. Next. He wrote, so I did banners throughout this exhibit. So the sculptures are 8 feet tall, and I'm 5'3", and the sculptures are 8 feet, and then we did 15-foot banners. He wrote with such intensity about his yearning for grace and transcendent experience. He electrified his church through gentle coaxing and mostly terrifying sermons about hell and repentance and then salvation. A rite of passage from affliction to grace. I have to tell you, I went to a Nick Cave concert 2 nights ago, and oh my God, I mean, this concert was waves upon waves of sound in the hand of God. I mean, he comes right out of the early Calvinist settlers. I mean, I know he's British, but no, actually he's Australian. But he came from these people as well. So here are some of his more intense words, which evidently he spoke not in a thundering voice, but in a quiet, involving voice. Next. As told to me by my friend, Catherine Reckless, a Jonathan Edwards scholar at Fordham University. I told her that her book reads something like a thriller, and it does. It's really great. Next. So, Jim, might you be the victim of my Jonathan Edwards language?
Yes.
Yes. May you be the parishioner? Because it's better if you direct it at one person. Forgive me. Okay, you, sinner, in the hands of an angry God. God holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a, next, spider, or some loathsome insect over the fire. He abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. Next. You can imagine how his congregation would go nuts with this kind of fear and affliction. They would be craving and craving to find a way to have grace. So on the front of his sculpture are other words that Jonathan Edwards wrote. He himself, next, had a vision of grace, which is why I feel he cared. He cared, so he would speak so harshly to people because he cared. So he wrote, "My soul, a secret place of my own in the woods." Next. where he would go to receive this feeling, to see the wonders of the wilderness of the world. Next, on his back are painted the words of my contemporary poet and friend Tom Slay, in which he, Tom, the poet, portrays himself in his poem, next, as the little dangling spider that I told Jim he was, which is painted on the back here in gray silver. And Tom's poem is titled Portrait of Myself as Jonathan Edwards Spider. Next, from Mr. Slay, here also comes the second half of the title of this exhibition. So it's Wilderness, and then it's Light Sizzles Around Me, which is in his poem. Next, early white European settlers in the Northeast arrived into, as Mary Rowlandson wrote in her 1675 Captivity Narrative. Now, you know I'm a reader, so most of what the people that I did sculptures of are people that I read about or people whose artwork I saw. So she wrote a book about her captivity by the Narragansett. Next, she wrote that they, as New England settlers, arrived into a vast howling wilderness. She was held in captivity by the Narragansett for 11 weeks and wrote, next, she wrote that not one offered the least miscarriage to her, which I take as, because I read her whole book, they didn't rape her, they didn't hurt her, they brought her into the tribe. And they actually enslaved her. They made a slave out of her. And then her husband bought her back, and she was released. Next, fearful of the deep woods, the colonists were obsessed with a yearning for confirmed salvation and afraid of out there and the Lucifers of the wilderness in here. The settlers, eager for safety and greedy for land, began a systematic annihilation of our Native American people. Next. Next. Oh, no, back. What? Okay, well, I guess we were right. To these Native Americans, the forests and mountains and plains held no fear. They were a refuge of beauty and a home. This is a spectacular country, and I completely, thank you, Martha, enjoyed my drive from the airport to here. I honor all these people. Next. I honor tonight Ray A. Youngbear, a contemporary Meskwaki poet whose poem is part of the exhibition. And, you know, I was so scared to get in touch with somebody who was different than myself, who was a Native American. I thought, I shouldn't do it. I am so definitely a white person. And a lot of people said, no, don't even do it, don't even go there. But Ray and I communicated through Facebook and through deep, fervent emails for over 2 years, and he wrote a poem and he contributed it to this exhibition. So I want to honor him here. You can look him up, and there are many books and poems that he's written. He writes here that this is a modern day replication of what his great-grandparents would have worn in the late 1800s. Next. And it has been an incredible honor for me to make an image of the famed Native American Sauk warrior Black Hawk, or in his language, Makatai Mishui Kiak. For this, after talking to Jean, I enlisted the permission. She said, you have to ask permission. You can't just make an image. You have to ask permission of the tribe. So I did. For this, I enlisted the permission and the help and advice of Joaquin Hamilton Youngbird. Next. He is the cultural ambassador, the tribal historian, and champion war dancer of the Sac and Fox Nation of Oklahoma. He is a fantastic person. With his wide knowledge, I checked on every detail of our image of Black Hawk. correcting mistakes long copied from old portraits. My assistant and I, we would actually send him every sentence that we were going to put in the banner, and we checked that the beads of the necklace that we were going to put on the image were the correct beads to put on him. Next, here is a painting by George Catlin in which he portrays Black Hawk holding horizontally on his arm something that looks to me, it's always looked to me like a dead crow. But Mr. Hamilton Younger taught me that the bird you see here in this painting is not just some ordinary dead bird, and it is incorrectly positioned. Next. My work here in this collage represents the truth of that bird. It is a head and tail feather fan that is used as a sacred ceremonial object which helps to fan the human spirit up to the great spirit in the sky. Next. Here is a detail of our cutting out the feather. Next. So this head and tail feather fan is made from the hollowed out body and feathers of an immature golden eagle, which is not that easy to come by. One has to apply to get a dead, immature golden eagle, which happens sometimes accidentally. Somebody shoots them accidentally, and then immediately they are taken and preserved for the use of Native American spirituality. I learned so much from Joaquin. So they are very protected. Joaquin himself, who you see here holding one, is making a head and tail feather fan, and he's going to line it with cotton or with soft leather. Next. Living at the turn of the 17 to 1800s, Black Hawk spoke out. He also wrote in his autobiography that was written from his words. He said these words, which are on his banner. Next. How smooth must be the language of the whites when they can make right look like wrong and wrong right. They coiled themselves among us like snakes. Next. Known in history as a warrior, Black Hawk's parting words in his book, however, are about peace. He said, "May the Great Spirit keep our people and whites at peace. This is the sincere wish of Black Hawk." This stealing of the Native American land is the first big stain on our land. The second, we all know, is slavery. Next. Here's my version of Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth is an abolitionist heroine sewn inside our history of enslavement. Early enslaved in the North, not the South, but in the North, she became a famed speaker and leader in the abolitionist movement, as did John Brown. When she achieved freedom, next, God gave her a new name. He gave her the name Sojourner because her mission was to travel up and down the country preaching of God, truth, and liberty. Then God gave her a second name, next. Truth. Aren't I a woman? How wonderful it is to have a name that is an exhortation to mission. Aren't I a woman, she said. Now tonight, you may know, but I'm going to tell you, what was the context for this phrase, aren't I a woman? Well, she was very tall. She was about 6'1", very tall, very powerful as a speaker. And she would go out in the world and talk about slavery and truth and religion. In that era, women were not supposed to go out and even listen to public speakers, and much less they were not supposed to go out and speak in public. If a woman had something that she wanted to say, she was supposed to say it to her brother, or to her father, or to her husband, or to her son. And the male person would speak out in public, not the female voice. So Sojourner Truth and Mary Rowlandson, to a certain extent, by writing her Captivity Narrative, broke those rules. So, thus, her audience would be really made up mostly of men. And they, at one point, they teased her. They said, you cannot be a woman. You are too tall to be a woman. And she said, no, I'm a woman. And they said, no, you can't. You look and you talk like a man. You are not a woman. And she said, aren't I a woman? And she began to unbutton the buttons of her blouse, and she opened it up and she revealed her breasts. And she said, aren't I a woman? So you can Google this, it's true. Can you imagine the strength and the courage and the anger of this powerful woman? So that is where that phrase comes from, aren't I a woman? Next. I'm going to speak to you now of two incredible men of this time, just before 1860, Dred Scott and John Brown. Dred Scott and John Brown, some say, launched the American Civil War. So how was this and how did this happen? I'm so aware, being here in Virginia, of the effect that the American Civil War had on this state and in this country. Next. First, let's talk about John Brown the Wild. This abolitionist preacher and father of 22 children. Okay, 3 wives, 22 children, from the Adirondacks, where I summered as a child. Next. He had a vision in church that caused him to raise his right hand and pledge, I, John Brown, come with the Lord's blessing to free every colored man in the territory. You are free. Follow me, children. Next. He is of the far edge, a seer from the wilderness of the Adirondacks, prophetic, inspiring, violent. Next. Herman Melville wrote, by the streaming beard is known Weird John Brown, the meteor of the war. John Brown felt that violence was needed to begin the slave liberation movement. He led small bands of his sons and other men to kill and massacre slaveholders in Bleeding, Kansas, the Potawatomi Massacre, and finally a raid on the Federal Army at Harper's Ferry. He was tried for treason, and he was picked up by Robert E. Lee and hung in 1859. I read that he was the first person to be executed for treason in the United States. Next. In my sculpture of John Brown, here, these beard hairs form a kind of, for me, a kind of waterfall, a wild rage, like an overflow of words that spew outwards and then down his front. Next. Each individual horsehair strand was actually knotted to lengthen it, because you don't find many horses with 8-foot tails. So it took months and months and months to complete just his beard as part of this exhibit by myself, my interns, and my assistants. Next. So right now would be a really good time for me to thank them. So here, next to me, is my dear studio manager, Sarah Ingber. Behind me is Heyman Young, costume designer, and then artist interns, Ayun and Isabella. Love comes from working together, but you can tell that this photo was a pre-pandemic photo, but we heard it was coming. Next. So here, as a smaller studio team, before we knew about masks, are Heyman and the incredible Alana Sears, fabulous painter. We continued to work together throughout, and then after this, we continued to work remotely. I actually would send packages by FedEx, and then I would get them back, and we would talk on the phone, and we would take photos. So a good part of this exhibit was done remotely. We had a deadline of June 5th, 2021, so we had to make that deadline. Next. And here we are, deep in the pandemic. Here is myself and Sarah working on Black Hawk. You see, we are masked. Windows open, freezing. We froze all winter with the windows open and masks on. Just Sarah and myself. Yes. And for me, that embrace of obsessive touch, that sense of repeated tactility, is a common part of my practice. Next. This is Mary Baldwin. I love that almost meditative sense of repetitive action. Next. Of time invested, the touch of the hand, the embroidery. Next. Whether it is in the beard or the clothing. Next. Or the thousands and thousands of hand-stenciled and hand-painted letters that fill this exhibition. That impulse holds true in nearly all my work, including my opera, a sense of obsessive tactility. Next, and now Dred Scott. So in my readings about this time period, I would read the name Dred Scott, and it was familiar to me. But again, I felt really ignorant. I didn't really know who he was or what he had to do with the American Civil War. So I read this really great book. But there are two Dred Scotts. There's a historical Dred Scott, but there is also a fantastic contemporary artist. Next. And his name is Dred Scott, who named himself Dred Scott 20 years ago when I met him early on in his art career. So please look him up and Google him. He is a fantastic, brave artist. So he, like Sojourner Truth, he gave himself a name of mission. And here are images of Dred Scott's flag. A man was lynched by police yesterday, and his recent reenactment of the 1811 slave rebellion in New Orleans. Next. So how do we know the historical Dred Scott? We know of him because he and his wife, Harriet, and with their two daughters, Eliza and Lizzie, filed a freedom suit in St. Louis, Missouri in 1847. Now, I will tell you in a minute that it is through court records that sometimes it is the only way that we find out things about our historical people. So because they filed a freedom suit, we know of them. Next. So why did they file on this particular date in 1847? That was because their daughter Eliza was almost 8, and 8 was a routine age that young girls would be put up and sold into slavery. So they filed, and then they could not be hired, or they could not be actively enslaved. They're still enslaved, but they had to give all their money that they made washing clothes to whoever it was owned them at the time. So, next. I researched this winding, circuitous path like a river. Next. I encourage you really to read this book. This is Dred Scott, A Life on Slavery's Frontier by Leah Vandervelt. She details the incredible strength of Harriet Robinson Scott. So I want to give this woman, Harriet Robinson Scott, and the writer, homage. Next. Dred and his wife Harriet and their two girls, Eliza and Lizzie. Here is their story. Next. They filed. Next. Oh wait, go back please. They filed and then they lost. Next. And then they won. Next. And then they lost. Next. And then they refiled. And then they lost. Next. And now they and we all finally lost really big when the infamous Dred Scott decision happened 10 years later in 1857, just right before the Civil War. the particular Supreme Court of 1857, our United States Supreme Court ruled against this family. And the ruling was, some states at that time were what were called free states, where you didn't have to have slaves, you could have free people working for you. So this Supreme Court ruled that black people from all over our country, no matter from what state, from what territory, that black people from all over our country, I've given this talk, and whenever I come to this, I feel like I'm weeping inside. From all over our country, that black people were inferior beings and could not have any rights more than a piece of merchandise or a donkey. This is our shame. Next. This inhuman decree threw oil on the fires that soon after became the American Civil War. It's what brought Abraham Lincoln from Illinois. Next. The American Civil War. So, back to Emily, my sculpture of Emily Dickinson. She actually wrote most of her poems during the American Civil War. So that is what opened the door for me to even speak to you tonight and to engage in my fierce reading and fierce learning about some visionary people in our history that have made us who we are. Next. Sojourner Truth, who you see here again, you're right, lived in Northampton, just 6 miles away from Emily Dickinson, right on here, in Amherst at the same time. And also writing at this time was Walt Whitman here in Orange, and he worked as a nurse in the hospitals in Washington, D.C., nursing the wounded. Next. And Nathaniel Hawthorne, also in Massachusetts, just before. I embroidered his whole suit with horsehair. Next. Text, for me, has such a transformative power. Those visual twists of letters that transmit emotions and thoughts inside of us. What is the first letter of your name? Whatever is the first letter of your name tends to be the most special letter for you. So the letters that make up words, each of these letters means something different to people who are reading them. So this exhibition and my talk tonight is about reading the words of others. Next, and almost last, I'd like to tell you about Mother Ann Lee. Mother Ann Lee was the founder of the Shakers, and it was called, not the Shakers, it was called, at that time, the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing in upstate New York in the 1700s. I debate about this because I think, okay, so what woman today would found a religion and would name herself as being the female version of Jesus Christ? So I say this with some timidity because in the Shaker world, there are some people who are strongly against my saying that. So today, the Shakers are known mostly for their furniture and their celibate and communal life. I used to go to these meetings about the Shakers, and I would always come home and tell my husband that, now I have to be celibate for the rest of my life. So the Shakers were also generations ahead of their time in practices such as accepting African Americans and Native Americans into the community, especially during the Civil War. Next. Here on Mother Ann Lee, dressed in traditional Shaker yellow, is an image of the blazing tree, an iconic image from the Shakers. Next. Sister Cahoon in 1845 had a vision after Mother Ann Lee died. When Mother Ann Lee died, they were bereft, her congregation of people. And there were Shakers all over this country, in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Massachusetts, in Maine. And they were bereft. And what happened 45 years after Mother Ann Lee died was that some of the young women during the midnight Shaker meetings started to have visionary experiences. Some of them were really interestingly extreme. So Sister Cahoon had a vision in which she saw a blazing tree that was on fire. So she wrote, "I felt curious when I took hold of it in her vision, lest the blaze should torch my hand. For me, this burning tree embodies the flame of ecstatic experience that gave the Shakers their name." Next. Consumed by the spirit rising up in them, they shook. They were Shakers. They weren't Quakers. They were Shakers who in worship spoke in tongues, danced, fell to the floor and worshiped. They would bark like dogs, caw like crows. Really, that's what I read. Next. Now, I have told you one story in which a woman, Sojourner Truth, had to define herself as a valid woman speaker in public. Mother Ann Lee as well went on the road preaching, and at one time her audience, mainly of men, stripped her naked for her temerity in speaking in public. I mean, this would be like seeing Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga being stripped naked by men because they shouldn't be so upfront and speak out. So this little religious celibate woman was stripped naked by men. Next. Now here, floating up to the ceiling, is my version of Heavenly Mother Ann Lee, my private idea of the persona of Mother Ann Lee in heaven. Next. Again, after Mother Ann Lee died in the era of manifestations, 1837 to 1850, she would send spirit messages. So I made her imaginary persona in this evanescent dress of yellow and white organza rising up. Next, at the bottom of this dress are two small figures. They are the later helpers who were called the instruments of the Shakers. They are the ones who received the spirit writings, the visions for paintings, and the songs. Next. So here are two of them that I made. Next. I learned a lot about the Shakers in 2019 in a Henry Luce Foundation Shaker colloquium that lasted for over a year and a half, with all of us coming from different parts of the country together in New York. So our motto became that Shakers are not just a chair. So I want to thank here Sally Promy, Director of Divinity at Yale, for her friendship and her guidance, and her book about the Shakers that I've read 3 times called Spiritual Spectacles. Next. And so many of the figures, as we come to a close in this wilderness exhibition, have a relationship to visual and impacting revelation. So how have I, in front of you here tonight, how have I come to have comfort with these searching, rapturous people? Next. Interesting. It is because I myself had an unasked for experience as a 14-year-old girl in Maine, looking out my window at the oak leaves on a tree in early winter. What happened? Next. Suddenly, I became all eye. My screen was dark, and I was given to see evil, and I was given to see good. And it was all encompassing, and it was all right. And it's always vulnerable for me to talk to you in person about this thing that happened to me when I was so young. So in this wilderness project, I am looking for something of an empathetic identity and validation of the spiritual experience that I myself had. a validation of spiritual awakening that includes evil and includes goodness. Next. Okay, these last two figures, you know, I'm an artist, so I also had to show you two historic artists who are my inspiration. This here, you can see text and image. This is one of the reasons I'm so attracted to Sister Gertrude Morgan's paintings. She lived in New Orleans from 1900 to 1988. Here she is using text and imagery from the book of Revelations in her work. Next. I love her. I have done much artwork about this powerful, mystical woman. Next. Here are her words. Holy, 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 glory, power, holy, 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 holy. Next. I heard a voice like a trumpet. So these are her visions. There is an all-seeing eye. Holy, holy. Next. I chose white for her dress because she had a vision that God told her she was to be the bride of Jesus. And that meant that she was to wear white the rest of her life. So, as we come to a close almost, do you know who else that I've spoken about wore white her entire adult life? No, I will tell you in a minute. Okay, that was a minute. So it was Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson wore white her entire life. We don't know why, and it was really not like Gone with the Wind white. It looked like a white bathrobe or house coat. She was so austere that she really didn't care what she wore. It was her form of wearing jeans that represented to her a spiritual awakening. Next. For my work with Sister Gertrude Morgan, I had bought Bill Fagley's book called Tools of Her Ministry about her, and then flew down to New Orleans to meet him. He died almost a year ago, and I want to give homage to this incredible man who has given us so much information about this extraordinary woman. Next. And then to close, I had to include one other artist. And why is that? That's because I'm an artist, and I just wanted to choose an artist who I really, really loved, and then I read about him. So let me tell you the things I learned. This is my version of the incredible painter Horace Pippen, who lived from 1888 to 1946. He fought in France in World War I with a segregated unit called the Harlem Hellfighters. He wrote, "I can never forget suffering, I will never forget sunset." The war brought out all the art in me. Next. Badly injured, Mr. Pippen was awarded the Purple Heart, and by France, the Croix de Guerre. He returned home to Pennsylvania during the height of Jim Crow America. Next. Thus, he was then active in an early movement among African Americans called Victory Abroad and Victory at Home, because they fought the war and they won it. And so they wanted to come home and be treated as heroes by our country. But they weren't, because it was Jim Crow. So this image is Victory Abroad and Victory at Home. Next. And please note this is an image of one of his paintings that he did of a vase full of flowers, but please note the vase is in the form of a V, and he painted the double V also in the painting. Next. Here is a painting by Horace Pippen of John Brown going to his hanging. So there's a crisscross relationship with everyone. Next to last sentence. Among all these often complicated spiritual people, that I investigated, that I researched, that I wove and embroidered and stenciled and painted. He wrote of his art inspiration simply, "Pictures come to my mind, and I tell my heart to go ahead." Pictures come to my mind, and I tell my heart to go ahead. Thank you very much. Now you can ask me anything about anything. But ask me, I read so much about each of, am I gone? Did my amplification get lost? Yes. Oh, am I in real time and space? All right. Well, then I'll come out here. I will come out here. Do you have any questions or thoughts or anything that you want to ask me? Or talk about yourself or your work? Or hi.
I was just wondering how you choose what fonts you're going to use and the significance of that.
Well, I was asked the question of what poets I choose to use and what is the significance of the poets. Well, I fell into Emily Dickinson. My mother gave me a book of Emily Dickinson poetry that was this thick. And I thought, oh no, because I've never really liked poetry that much. I've always been a prose reader. I like the density of it, and I like the storiness of it. With poetry, I always felt that it would be down at the bottom of the page before the words had a chance to sink in. So when I got her book from my mother, I thought oh, Mom. And then I thought, well, I have to read some of it. So I just opened the book. And then, this thing happened to me that some of her words I would read, and her words, some of them just jumped into my eyes and into my body, and they started making images for artwork. So it was like electrical bluebirds came from her words into my eyes and into my body. It's like drinking wine. The wine is outside your body, and then it's inside your body, and it's having an effect. And that's what happened to me with Emily Dickinson. Oh no, I think I'm okay.
No, use the mic.
Oh, use the mic.
I can't hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Now, okay. Do you want me to repeat this story? Okay. So her words word jumped off the page and into my body, take all away from me, but leave me ecstasy, bypassed my cognitive mind, and just started making images for artwork that said, well, make me now. And so then it turned out that I could work in any medium as long as, for 7 years, I was monogamous to Emily Dickinson for 7 years. I didn't use any other poet. I just used her. And because of the courage of her writing, split the lark and you'll find the music. I felt my life with both my hands to see if it was there. The thrill came slowly like a boon. I like a look of agony because I know it's true. The truth of these words activated something in me. I'd always been a reader, but I felt like I had found this secret book, this treasure trove that I am still continually harvesting and farming for reading. So, and then I thought also if I talked about my vision or I talked about the intensity of reading the words, that maybe I would they would be lost. They would come out of me and then they would be lost. But that hasn't happened. And I continue to read poetry, and I read Neruda, Rilke, and my friend Tom Slay, especially who you see here. And I read like I scan. I just turn the pages like I'm not really looking at the words, and if they jump, then I can use them. So that's Dickinson, and yeah, and it's the same for Neruda, Rilke, Tom Slay. Yeah. Good question. Yes.
Forgive me, I'm going to take it down. So
I forgive you.
You've been working on this collection for 7 years now, and I wanted to ask.
10, really. Yeah.
Do you feel like this line of questioning, that urge to know more about it, do you feel like it's resolved now, or is there more in there to dig out?
Did you hear the question? Do I feel that there's more for me to do in the nature of this body of work, of working as an artist with history, whereas usually I'm an artist that works with language and poetry. So I do feel that somehow with Sister Gertrude Morgan and with Horace Pippen, that I have come to a close, that somehow this eccentric, one-by-one choosing of people. First, I went historically, so first it was Anne Hutchinson, and then in some of the books I would read about her, and then I would read about Jonathan Edwards, and then in the Shaker Colloquium group, there was Catherine Reckless, who wrote a book on Jonathan Edwards, and so I read her book, so she loved him, so I loved him, and then they mentioned Edward Taylor, and then it would move on to Sojourner Truth and the abolitionists. They would talk about John Brown, who I knew something of from the Adirondacks, but not quite enough. So I read about him and Bleeding Kansas and Potawatomi. And then floating in the air around these books was Dred Scott. And I was scared to read about him because I felt that he is so, I could just feel the way other authors wrote about Dred Scott and the Supreme Court, that this was a turning point in our country, and that this turning point actually was the match that lit the American Civil War. So in the book, that was about Mrs. Dred Scott, that writer who is so incredible, she said, Harriet and Dred, they didn't write, they didn't have journals, they didn't have diaries, they were illiterate. So how does a historian write a book that is so readable about their times and who they were? And she did it from the lists of who were slaves with whom. When did they get on the boat? When did they get off the boat? Remember, slaves were property, so you had to keep track of property. So she followed the track of the property. Oh, I am so sorry. And so in the book, she would write about every decade of what was happening in the country and how it affected Dred and Harriet and their two girls. And so that for the last 10 years of their life, after they filed suit, they had to live in the alleyways of St. Louis, where a lot of sort of disenfranchised Black people live, people of color. And this was confusing to me because they were still slaves. They were still owned by someone. But that person, once you filed in the courts, white people didn't want you working in their homes. But they wanted you working so they could get the money that you made washing clothes for other people. So they still had to work, and they had to give money to their owner. Now their owner, this is a very complicated story. And again, forgive me, world, they were merchandise, right? And they were earners. They were making money, and this money was going into other people's pockets. So Dr. Emerson was the original owner of Dred Scott, and then he met, Dred met Harriet and fell in love way up in the Northwest Territories in Native American country. So I learned a lot about the French and the Sioux and the people, the North American territory. And then Dr. Emerson, because he was a captain in the U.S. Army, he was transferred, I don't know, somewhere else. But Dred and Harriet would go with him. And then he was transferred someplace else, but he didn't want to bring them. So he lent them to somebody else. And then he got married. And then his wife, Mrs. Emerson, wanted to get the slaves back. So Harriet and Dred, who by now had 2 little children, brought, they were like little, because it wasn't until Eliza was 8 that they filed for freedom suits. I actually thought for a while, I may still do it, because actually there is an overflow of wilderness in my work, but it would be the idea of actually making a freedom suit. You know what? I give it to you. I give that idea of making a freedom suit to you. It's such a good idea. So, and you can use words in your work. I give it all to you. It's such a complicated story. I want to make sure to be able to tell it to you right. So Dr. Emerson died. And so Mrs. Emerson had Dred and Harriet and the 2 little girls. Mrs. Emerson decided she would go to Springfield. This was in St. Louis, Missouri. So when Harriet and Dred moved into the alleyways, Mrs. Emerson decided she would go visit her sister in Springfield, Massachusetts. And her husband, Dr. Emerson, had died. So she was with her sister in Springfield, Massachusetts. So John Chafee, I guess, fell in love with her. And I don't really know what love was like in those days, really. But John Chafee fell in love with her and married her. But John Chafee was a fervent abolitionist. And he was riding into power by the votes of people who would vote for the Republicans. Now, in those days, the Republicans were the party of Abraham Lincoln. So could John Chafee name himself as an abolitionist when his wife owned 2 slaves? Could not. So immediately, I don't know how fast things went in those days, but I guess immediately a letter went, and they were sold. But they weren't freed. They were sold, but Mrs. Emerson did not free them. And she could have, but she didn't. So, right? So many forms of injustice. Why not? She was living in Springfield. She had nothing to do with their lives. So she didn't free them. But they were freed in 1857 because there was such a big to-do about the Supreme Court saying that black people were inferior beings, that the courts in St. Louis said, okay, you're free. I mean, it was just like, okay, we're done. You're free. You two, who started this lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court, they didn't, we are done with you. And okay, so now you're free then. So they became free. They were celebrities at that time, and they had their photo in the newspaper, but they didn't want to be celebrities because Dred didn't want that for his family because they had gone through such hardships. And, they won, and they lost, and they won, and then they lost. Why am I telling this story? I think because somebody asked about how did I choose this particular group of people? Like, I didn't sit down like, okay, so now I'm going to start with Anne Hutchinson, and then I'm going to go to Edward Taylor, and then it's just through reading. And through reading, to move through history, and through the reading of people's actual writing. So Mary Rowlandson wrote her Captivity Narrative, which is really interesting. I mean, the chief made her a slave. He made her sew him white shirts. And she ate what the Narragansett tribe in Massachusetts ate, which was not much. And she ate, she wrote in her journal, they were starving almost all the time, but once they shot and they killed a deer who was pregnant. And she writes in her Captivity Narrative, I never thought, as I can't exactly talk in that particular cadence, but she said, never a thought to me would be that I would eat the unborn fetus of another animal. But the bones were so soft and I was so hungry. So through this very clear, kind of weird writing that she does, I learned about her life. And then Black Hawk also wrote an autobiography, or he dictated it to a Frenchman who translated, who knew Sauk language. And then, then what? Then I had to have a Native American person because the Figge Museum was in the heart of the Meskwaki Nation. So I got to know Ray Youngbear, and I had been told by the woman who works at the Iowa Historical Society. She said, no, I know the Youngbears, and they are very proud people, and they are very protective of their heritage. They are not going to want to speak to you. You are a white woman, and they will want to have nothing to do with you. And I thought, oh no. But I thought, that's just exactly what I thought. So I sent him a printout of some of the images that I had already made and my mission statement, and I sent it by mail. So, I mean, he emails a lot, but by mail. And then one day I did just get an email back from him, and then we started emailing, and we started emailing sort of visionary secrets that each of us had. So, which I can't tell you because he made me promise that I would never tell anybody about this, or never tell anybody about this, or never tell anybody about this. So I learned a lot from him. I'm going on and on. Do you want to end this? Yeah.
So a lot of the dresses
Yes.
are elongated.
Yes.
You say they were all 8 feet tall?
Yeah.
So talk about your choice of making them so long, both length and in narrowness.
They are giants of historical visionary people. So I wanted to make them giants. Also, the ceiling height in my studio is only 8.5 feet. And they're very slender. They're like 1 inch or 2 inches wide. Because, I'm a shy person, and sometimes I feel I barely exist because I'm such a shy person. It's like I'm walking backwards into sociability. I'm so lucky I married a really sociable guy because he can ride that horse. So I made them really flat and thin, and so that you couldn't see them from one way. And then if you walked in front of them, you could see them, and all the writing and all the obsession and tactility. You're so patient, because there were all the preview thank yous and stuff like that. So, I mean...
you said that, like, the beard that you made, you also embroidered with horsehair?
Yeah.
Why did you choose horsehair?
I chose horsehair because it was so bristly, and it just reminded me, in the Adirondacks, we would go hiking, and all the briars and, in the woods, everything was kind of spiky and scratchy. And then somehow over the years, I had, as a sculptor, you accumulate things. And I had accumulated a lot of beautiful white horsehair. So I thought, when I've used horsehair before, so I know the touch of it, and I kind of yearned for it. The touch of it's very bristly, and no horse died for it. No, really, I researched that. I called the place. It was an equestrian place that used the horsehair for dressage. So they said, no, we we get it from China, and no horses died because they want the horses to keep growing the tails. Yeah. So all the things that go into making artwork. Did that answer that question, Pam? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
I know, I just couldn't stop talking. Okay.